every year, and we know. So actually, Professor Xue Guang had taught at our department, and his lecture uh, had been wide, um, had been very much welcomed at Tsinghua and across China at the other universities. We know Xue Guang um, have been working very hard in several affairs. Uh, for me, she started uh, digging the field of property rights and then shifted to the governance of the Chinese government at various levels. Um, my, I personally am not very familiar with his work, especially his recent work. Of course, when I was doing my PhD work at Chicago, I was very familiar with Professor Xue Guang's work in stratification. But recent years, I lost and they did not follow his research. Today, it's very a good opportunity for us to listen to Xue Guang to introduce his new book, and I'm sure. So after so many years, his work in the field of governance, I'm sure he had very fruitful results. I am hoping in the future we could have the chance to invite Xue Guang to come to Tsinghua again and give us talks and lectures, and even can give us lectures on his new book. So I wish this event very successful, and hoping and looking forward to hearing some other professors' remarks. Back to you, Zhang Yang.
Okay, thank you, Tianfu.
Yeah.
So now, please join me in welcoming Professor Zhou to present his book. Professor Zhou, you will have 30 minutes for the presentation. Okay, please share the screen.
Okay. Oh, thank you, Tianfu, and thank you, Zhang Yang. So let me first share my PPT. I hope you can see this. Can you see?
Yes.
My PPT, all right? Okay, great. So let me first, I want to thank the organizers and the panelists for your participation, taking your time to participate in this event. I very much look forward to your comments and the dialogue in the discussion session. And I also want to thank all of you who are in the audience for being here. In my introduction today, I want to just talk about two items. So let me start here. And the first one is the motivation and the context of the research project that led to this book. And the second, I want to have a brief sketch of the key issues and the framework that organize this book. Okay. So, so let me begin with the first item, the motivation and the context of this research. As we all know, the reform and the opening up era of the last 40 years in China has really witnessed the most rapid economic growth in the Chinese history. It also provided really tremendous opportunities for those scholars to study China, especially in the form of close observations and ethnographic research, as many of us have done research in the last 4 decades. As we get close to the Chinese society, to what is going on in the Chinese context, and scholars, many of us found there's a set of really interesting paradoxical phenomena and issues. So for example, on the one hand, in the context of rapid economic development and social change, and we witness the leading role of the state and local governments. with tremendous mobilizational capacities. And that partly accounted for the rapid economic success in China. On the other hand, we also witnessed really political cycles shifting between centralization and decentralization. And we witnessed frequent political twists and turns over the years. And at a lower level, we also observed flexible implementation, collusion, and loose coupling between policymaking and policy implementation, as many studies attest to these phenomena. And if we look at this relationship between the state and the bureaucracy at the lower level, there's also the cycles of shifting between what I called the tight coupling between policymaking and implementation, but also many times loose coupling. The local government could be very responsive, but also resistant to top-down policies in implementation. And there is coexistence of what we call the acceleration of downward pressures, 层层加码, and at the same time, collusions among local governments, 变通 and 共谋. And we also observed the coexistence of high mobilizational capacities in the Chinese bureaucracy, but also considerable inertia. And these phenomena are really widespread in different areas and localities. Many studies showed similar phenomena in family planning, in environmental regulations, in urbanization processes, and more recently, in the poverty alleviation campaigns. So these phenomena are interrelated and widespread. Now, these phenomena, the observations, really me interested in what I would call the institutional logic of governance, by which I mean those recurrent, predictable, and often causal relationships based on stable institutional arrangements. So this book and this project, I try to provide a unified framework to probe, to understand the underlying mechanisms across disparate cases and areas and over time. And part of the contribution of this book, I hope, is provide a set of analytical concepts and middle-range theoretical models that help explain or make sense of these observed phenomena. So let me just say a few words about the context of my research project that led to this book. I started my fieldwork in 2005, and I never expected it lasted this long, but it lasted more than a decade. I went to this agricultural town in northern China several times each year. Each time I'll stay a few days up to a few weeks. And in the first few years, I actually spent several months in this township. And during this period of time, I started publishing my observations, my findings in academic journal, in the form of academic articles in academic journals, mostly in Chinese and published in China. And by the end of 2013, I collected these articles and submitted a book manuscript to the press. And it took 3 long years before it was finally published in 2017. So the book manuscript actually was completed by end of 2013. And thanks to the pandemic, when also all of us experienced this, our research was unexpectedly disrupted because of the pandemic. And in the shelter in place and staying at home, I realized that there's nothing better to do than rewrite my book, which was published in Chinese, rewrote it into English. And so it was, I worked on this book manuscript for the last 2 years. And finally, it was published last year at Cambridge University Press. So that's the larger context of this book project. And the organizing theme for this book really is the recognition, what I call the fundamental tension between the centralization of authority on the one hand and the effective local governance on the other. And this fundamental tension exists over time, historically, but also across many areas in Chinese society, in the areas of governance. So the logic of argument in this book really to first recognize the fundamental tension, then ask the question, how did the Chinese state over time respond to this tension? And I argue that over time, there rose a set of institutional responses in the form of stable institutions and stable practice that try to respond to this tension, try to alleviate the pressures from this fundamental tension. But by doing so, it induces some unintended consequences that will affect China's political economic transformation in the future, as we witnessed in the last 4 decades, and now also into the future. And this table is was presented in chapter 1 of this book. It really provided the conceptual framework for the theme that organized this book. So I started with the fundamental tension that is based on centralization of authority on the basis of hierarchies and ideology on the one hand, and the capacity of local problem solving on the other. And that triggered institutional responses. Here I listed four these different mechanisms, which elaborate in using case studies in the book. And also I discussed the anticipated consequences because of this, the rise of institutional responses. So I want to now unpack this table and the conceptual framework and provide some elaboration of the concepts, issues, and arguments in this book. So I'm now shifting to the second part that discuss the kind of issues and theoretical models that organized this book. So let's start with issue. The first issue is about the fundamental tension. As we all know, there's a tendency in the Chinese political system, both in history and today, the tendency towards the centralization of authority. It is often in the form of policymaking, the decision rights of policymaking centralized at the top and through a top-down process. The typical way we think about this, the way we talk about this is 号令自中央出 and 顶层设计. And there's a persistent effort to centralize control over resources and personnel management. And of course, we witness the ultimate and arbitrary power of the state historically and today. But on the other hand, we also know there's a very diverse cultural, economic, and social environments across different regions and different localities. And for example, there's a huge divide between rural and urban, between the coastal areas and the inland areas, between the state-owned and private-owned arenas. So effective local governance really requires a different way of approaching these issues, the capacity and effectiveness of local problem solving, how to deliver, for example, public goods provision, resolving local conflicts, and extracting resources. So these two modes, the resolving local problems and centralization towards center, really creates the fundamental tension, which I wrote in this book. The high degree of centralization of authority is at the expense of the effectiveness of governance at local level. Conversely, the more decentralized the governance structure, the more effective local governance is, the more likely that it will or is perceived as to undermine and weaken the authoritarian state. So this is where the centralization, the fundamental tension lies. As we all know, as well established already in the literature, the Chinese state is established built on two pillars, organization and ideology. Sherman's book publishing in 1960s already discussed these two themes. But on the other hand, both organization and ideology ran into crisis in the last 4 decades, and even longer. So first of all, we can think about the limit of bureaucracy. As many studies have shown, the boundary rationality and diverse bureaucratic interests get into way of policy implementation. The principal agent problems, as discussed widely in the social science literature, are amplified by the size and scale of the gigantic bureaucracy in China. And as we know, implementation processes often involve multiple layers and multiple agents with diverse interests. So there's a serious limit to the bureaucratic management and governance. And also we also see the crisis associated with ideologies and beliefs. The society over the years become much more diverse in beliefs, in interests, and the traditional culture, Confucian culture, and the official ideology all went into crisis from time to time, as we witnessed in social media and so on and so forth. So all these crises related to organizations and their ideology also put more pressures on the fundamental tension. And this is where we have to think about how the state or the institutions respond with their different response mechanisms and what are the consequences of these mechanisms. So let me now shift to the 4 response mechanisms identified in this book and discussed in this book. The first response mechanism is what I called the uniformity in policymaking and flexibility in implementation. So we all know that uniformity in policymaking and symbolic centralization has been key trademark in the Chinese political system. So major decisions are made from the top and carried out through so-called 顶层设计. But this institutional arrangement also allows and encourages or give acquiescence to flexibility in local implementation. So we observed a wide range of phenomena. Sometimes the policy was made in a very general term, which allows local governments to add details to this whatever policy advocacy. Sometimes policies are specific, but it allows deviations in implementation. And also, many times we see specially tailored policy, such as special economic zone. And also, resources are allocated to the lower levels for policy implementations. And also, as Zhou Lian advocated, the administrative subcontract system also provides this kind of what I will call the flexibility in policy implementation. Now, because of these institutional arrangements, what we find is what I call a variable coupling across levels of bureaucracy. That is, the allocation of control rights at different levels of bureaucracy creates many flexibilities in the system. If we think about the Chinese bureaucracy along 3 levels, the principal, the supervisor, and the agent. Correspondingly, we think about the central government and intermediate governments and the local governments. And we can conceptualize a theory of control rights. And this is one of, I think, the contribution of this book. It developed several mid-range theoretical ideas and models, and this is one of that. So we think about how the control rights are allocated in the Chinese bureaucracy. And in this book, I conceptualize 3 dimensions of control rights. One is goal setting. The second one is inspection. The third one is provision, the control rights over provision of incentive and the policy implementation. Now, by allocating these 3 dimensions of control rights across different levels, sometimes at principal level, sometimes at supervisor level, or some other levels, we can see a variety of mode of governance. So for example, along these 3 different combinations of these control rights at different levels, principal or supervisor level, we could observe very different mode of governance. Sometimes could be tightly coupled, sometimes a subcontract form of governance, sometimes loosely coupled, and at times it could even become federalism, characteristic of federalism. I'm not going to get into the details of these discussions, but I want to highlight that from these specific issues we discussed and the middle-range theoretical models we propose in this book, we can really see that the Chinese bureaucracy is not static one mode, either centralized or or decentralized. Rather, it really evolves over time depending on how these different type of control rights are allocated across different levels. I will now shift to the second response mechanisms, that is the interdependence between formal and informal institutions. Of course, we all know formal institutions have been there all the time to ensure top-down control and stability. We talk about control over resources and control over allocation of personnel. But there's also the importance of the role of informal institutions in governance practice to allow flexibility. And here, researchers have already discovered a wide range of practice. The coexistence between formal authority and substantive authority in the hands of local governments. There are symbolic compliance versus collusion and selective implementation, and loose coupling at the lower levels, and loose coupling between policy making and policy implementation to alleviate the fundamental tension. All these issues have been discussed, recognized, and really carefully understood in the literature. What I have been doing here is try to integrate this insight into the largest picture about how China has been governed into the larger conceptual framework. The third response mechanism is what I call the ritualization of official ideology. As we all know, in the long Chinese tradition, governance by morality or 道德治国 has been one of the key characteristics in China's governance. And since 1949, the Communist Party continued this practice in terms of political education and propaganda efforts from 1949 and even present today. But over the years, we also witnessed the erosion of the official ideology. Partly that's due to the cultural erosion with more effort to replace Confucian culture with the Marxist ideology, and partly in more recent years with the rise of a pluralistic society. So what happened is that over the years, we find that political rhetoric becomes more a ritual and symbolic compliance. And so it turns all these political propaganda, political rhetoric from political weapon of control to political rituals. These rituals are still important because they signal the acceptance of the central authority and they provide the basis to exercise top-down power. But it really introduced flexibility between symbolic compliance and actual behaviors. So there's the third response. Now, if we think about these response mechanisms we have already discussed, they really produce the variable coupling. There is sometimes loose coupling, sometimes tight coupling between policymaking and implementation. So for example, the shifts among different modes of governance in the bureaucracy can shift into different either tight coupling, subcontracting, or loose coupling. And the informal institutions and practice introduce flexibility in policy implementation through 变通 and 共谋, and the ritualization of official ideology and symbolic compliance also allows the decoupling between what they say and what they do. So all these contribute to the variable coupling that alleviates the tension between centralization on the one hand and local flexibility in policy implementation. But the problem is that there's no stable equilibrium between the two sides of the fundamental tension. So what is the boundary of flexibility, for example? You either over-centralize, you have the loss of a local initiative, or you decentralize and you subject to the risk of so-called the loss of control. And the economic literature discuss these kind of shifts. And there are many times we witness organizational failures in incentive design. And so that allows shifts of puts the shifts across different mode of governance almost become a major issue to deal with. So the central authority in this larger context tried very hard to retain the ultimate power of intervention, the ability to disrupt local government actions and to redefine the boundaries of flexibility. And how do they do that? They do that through campaign-style mobilization. That's the fourth response mechanism I want to discuss now. Campaign-style mobilization serves an important political weapon for dealing with pursuing policy targets or rectification of bureaucratic problems, at least from the eyes of the state. So folks, we witnessed these kind of major shifts due to political campaign-style mobilization in the Chinese political history. So for example, in 1980s, the so-called 思想解放运动 really put a shift from a tight coupling in a Mao era to loose coupling or decentralization in a post-Mao era. And in the last decade, the anti-corruption campaign really is another effort to shift from loose coupling to tight coupling or re-centralization. So campaign-style mobilization played a very important role in shifts across different modes of governance, as we discussed in the control rights theories. Now, another dimension discussed in this book is about state-society relationships. Because of time limit, I'm not going to get into this. But let me just move on to talk about the third set of issues, that is the unanticipated consequences because of the response mechanisms and the stable institutional arrangement we just outlined. So clearly, there's a delicate balance between centralization and decentralization, and which lead to really unstable equilibria over time. So there's a persistent tension between the centralization of authority and the rule of law, and there's a persistent tension between the arbitrary power and the rationalization of a rule-based bureaucracy. And there's a tension between the arbitrary power and the professionalization in different areas of the contemporary society. Now, this book is drawing on the kind of conceptual framework and issues I just outlined, and connect these to my empirical research, the case studies, and ethnographic field work in China. So the book is organized in these three parts. The first part is more macro institutional mechanisms, discuss about the relationship between the state and the Chinese bureaucracy from a Weberian point of view, and discussed different mode of governance from a control right theory framework, as I just outlined, and it discussed campaign style mobilization. The second part of the book, the logical governance and government behaviors, really focus on specific issues in the field work. For example, about bureaucratic bargaining, collusions among local governments, and governmental regulations in local areas, and how that imposes the multiple constraints in local government behaviors, and also how local governments exercise their power for downward extraction of resources. The third part, the logical governance and Chinese society, really is connecting the state with the society and see how internal logic really affects state-society relationships. Here, I provided a set of case studies. One is on the public goods provision in road pavement project. Another case is about local elections, village elections over 12 years span of time, and also collective action based on an organized interest. So that's the brief outline of the structure of this book. So let me summarize what I try to do in this book. The goal of my book is try to uncover the stable internal logic of governance in China. And I hope that this book provides a unified framework to account for the observations and phenomena across different areas and over time. And this book also aims to provide a set of analytical concepts, middle-range theoretical ideas, and models for sense-making, interpretation, and explanation of what I have observed in the fieldwork and in other cases in the literature. So I hope this book help us update our knowledge about China's governance, and I also hope it will stimulate new lines of research. So let me stop here. I very much look forward to the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Professor Zhou, please ending the sharing. Okay, good. So thank you, Professor Zhou, for this wonderful presentation. Now I will invite our four discussants to deliver their comments. Each of you will have 10 minutes. I will start with Professor Mary Gallagher, who is a professor in political science at the University of Michigan. Mary, would you please start?
Thanks, Yang, and thanks for inviting me to this book talk. I'm really excited to discuss Xue Guang's book. I mean, I have to say, this book is very impressive. I really love the framework. I think it's very ambitious, but at the same time, I think it makes a lot of sense to how we understand China. It's also very good at merging discussion of both imperial China and contemporary China, which is often quite difficult to do. I think you do it at a level of abstraction that works, and I would love to know if you're being heavily criticized by historians, but I thought it was quite effective. And it's also ambitious because it merges, as Xue Guang was just discussing, discussion in the first part about the bureaucracy, the second part center local, and then the third part state society into a kind of a general theory. I've actually been teaching chapter 11 on organized interest and collective action for the last 20 years. I think it was written in 1993, which is when I first started graduate school. And I'm assuming, Xue Guang, you can't be that much older than me. You were probably an assistant professor. So, I mean, that article is written about, it's really written about pre-reform China, but it continues to have, I think, a lot of logic for how collective action has worked in China generally, even in the reform period. So I have a number of questions. They are, I think, questions partly about how you see the book in terms of how graduate students in particular might use the book as inspiration, and also just some questions about interpretation of the general theory given what's happening in China right now. So most of my questions, the substantive questions, are about the period that we seem to be in, which is what you say very clearly is a period of re-centralization. So there are two questions I have that are more about the research design. So one question I have, and I would love for graduate students who are on this call to hear, is the method of participant observation. I think can be very, very powerful. Any kind of ethnography or interview type fieldwork can really enlighten us as to how the mechanisms in Chinese governance actually work. I'm really interested in whether you thought it was and I guess based on some of your remarks today, which I didn't understand before, it sounds like the fieldwork for this book ended at the beginning of the current period. And so I'm wondering whether or not you felt that there was a kind of Heisenberg effect, in the sense that, did you start to think that you were affecting the results? Did people understand that you're a famous professor, you're from Stanford University? Did you start to worry that the data that you were collecting was affected by, your presence? This is something obviously foreigners worry about all the time, and often impedes our ability to do effective fieldwork in China. And that's irregardless of the political constraints on fieldwork. So the second question I have, which is more about research design and the ambition of the book, I really like that the book takes into account the importance of scale, which is something I'm constantly saying to my colleagues in political science who study European countries that are smaller than most Chinese provinces. So I think it's really great that you take that into account, because I think many people fail to take into account the scale of Chinese governance. But I want to know how you think about you're doing research in a single, it seems like mostly in a single place in northern China, but it is, I think it makes sense and it can be generalized to the entire country. But at the same time, you also recognize Chinese diversity and uneven development. So do you think that your logic applies differently to different localities? Do you think that the argument is, it basically works for any part of China? So that's the second question, which is sort of about the design of the book. I have a couple of questions just about the argument in the book. I was really interested in the argument you make about the professionalization of society in conflict with move towards greater centralization. And you note that this has impacts on people, particularly in the white collar, in people in white collar work. So not about capital, you know, big entrepreneurs, and really not about labor, but about this mid-range of people like us, medical doctors, lawyers, professors, journalists, and this increasing gap between you being in a professional organization or affiliation that drives you towards certain types of behavior, but yet we're in a moment in China right now where re-centralization is putting a lot of emphasis on political ideology and on ritual kind of performative compliance. And I'm really interested in what you think the implications of this are for not Chinese political governance, but for other types of governance. So when you go to see a doctor, or when you go to see a lawyer, or when you go to university, and how does this affect people's perceptions of these professions? Because there are lots of arguments in the political science discipline about, you know, what are the groups that eventually become important to political change. And there's a book that, you know, obviously Barrington Moore talks about the bourgeoisie, but more recent research, I think, really focuses on white collar professionals as being particularly important to dissatisfaction with certain types of centralization. One of the questions is another question I have, which is about the substance of the book. And this is something I think that we all struggle with empirically, which is that you observe in the last decade, there's been increased centralization. There's a debate within political science whether or not this is deinstitutionalization or institutionalization and better kind of rule of law at the grassroots, whereas at the very elite level, there's sort of, you know, kind of more arbitrary power. And so some people see kind of more effective central control as evidence of state capacity, which we would identify as a characteristic of modern bureaucratic states. But you argue that centralization impedes bureaucratic professionalization. But I think empirically right now in China, it's actually very hard to distinguish what is bureaucratic professionalization and what is centralization under arbitrary power. And I think about zero COVID, and I think about, you know, the ability to get zero COVID compliance as actually kind of difficult to tell. Is this just a state with greater capacity and a more effective bureaucracy, or is really this about centralization of power? And how can we distinguish these things when we're doing research? I think that's really important for students to understand. Okay, my last comment is about the conclusion, and I thought the conclusion was great because it is very open-ended, but it's not teleological. You're not talking about China going into, you know, in a certain direction. It's not about China going in a kind of Western, you know, competitive political system. It's not about necessarily China going towards a more authoritarian position, but it's very, very open-ended. And I'm wondering about what you think you talk about the last 40 years as an experiment that kind of departed from the past, and when China wasn't fluctuating so much between centralization and decentralization, it was largely more decentralized. Because during this period of the last 40 years, Chinese society changed dramatically. Chinese economy changed dramatically. So what do you see as the legacy of this period, given this new period of centralization and ideological control? Will it create new institutional options? Will it just fade away into the past? I think that is something that we're all wondering about right now. So thanks very much. I'm really happy to read the book.
Thank you so much, Mary, for your insightful comments and very interesting questions. So now I would like to have invite Professor Yingyao Wang, Assistant Professor of Sociology from the University of Virginia, to have comments. Professor Wang, please.
Yes, yeah, thank you. First of all, I want to thank you, Shi Jianshou and Tsinghua Sociology for organizing this book talk, and special thanks for Zhang Yang and Yang Fei for putting this talk together and for giving me this opportunity to comment on Professor Zhou's latest book. So for someone who, like me, who also have worked on tracing the evolution of the Chinese bureaucracy, Professor Zhou's work has been an excellent model and a great source of inspiration for my own work. So this book really kind of provides a grand synthesis of Professor Zhou's early and latest writings on this topic, and with a new and a heightened level of theoretical ambition towards providing overarching explanation of basically how Chinese government works, as you see in the presentation. And because of time, of course, also because astonishing clarity of the argument in this book, I think I will not get into the details of the richness of the argument. So the book actually does an amazing job summarizing the argument along the way. And there's actually not a single page where the argument was not clear. So I will just here maybe highlight some, and certainly not all, what I think are the book's central contributions. First, I think the book's analytical approach is really bold and simultaneously methodical. It identified this central and fundamental tension in the Chinese way of governing, namely the one between centralized authority and local governance. And this observation may echo many sort of casual observations or popular understandings of the Chinese government and its problems. But the author is really able to go from there and explain that this overarching logic actually sets off a few generalized institutional responses, including variable coupling and complementary between formal and informal institutions, and the campaign style mobilization, which in turn gave rise to a wide variety of government behavior ranging from bargaining to collusion. So I think the author here really kind of turns this intuitive insights into building a very sophisticated analytical scaffolding. And in the end, I found this tension response behavior model is parsimonious enough to generate a theory, but also very flexible and copious to accommodate this book exemplifies kind of period-specific and policy-specific variations and processes and the change. So relate to this point, and I think the theoretical model is as malleable and precise also because the book makes good use of the tools from organizational sociology. So questions that are commonly explored in organizational sociology are well resonated in this book, such as the issue of bounding and rationality, principal-agent relations, organization-environment interactions, and the allocation of attention and resources, and so forth. So I think the use of organizational analysis in this book really has two advantages. First, in some ways, it kind of productively defamiliarize some of the phenomena that we're kind of accustomed to explaining, such as centralization and decentralization, that in this case, Professor Zhou used the idea of coupling. And another concept I found was very generative, the control right. We know that property rights is a very complicated issue in China, and also the right of govern is multi-layered, and there's division label between them. So control right is very productive as a meso-level concept to unpack this phenomenon. And I think the second advantage associated with using organizational analysis is really making China an effective case for comparison. So it really kind of gave us a shared problems to work with and a shared language to talk about the issues. And in some ways, it does the discipline a great service that how we can translate our heuristic understanding of China and a very context-specific knowledge into meso-level explanation that can travel, that also can make China a case for comparative work. So I have perhaps a few questions I also would like to ask that derives from the book and also inspired by the conclusion, and then that perhaps can help us think more about China's past and future. And the first question is that I think the book raised a really compelling puzzle that how a country, with a size comparable to that of Europe can be effectively governed. And then the author kind of productively I mentioned that this, there is a tension, and this tension does generate instabilities and the problems and constant negotiations. In some cases, waste of resources and also traumatic political events. But I was also wondering to what extent, and this is a thought kind of worth entertaining, is that precisely because of the tension and the readjustment, and precisely because the combination of formal and informal institutions, there was some kind of built-in resilience in the Chinese model, so to speak, that holds China actually together in spite of its size and its diversity and all that. So the book also mentioned this sort of the kind of trade-off between efficiency and stability. I wonder whether maybe in some period efficiency was a preferable goal, and in some period stability, should it be the concern here? So to what extent we should trade these trade-off also as a source of resilience and adaptation and flexibility in some ways. So my second question is kind of relate to Mary's observations about some recent new political and social and economic development. Namely is that re-centralization and to some extent the re-centralization is also translated to, as the book also observes, that a bureaucratization of Chinese society and also the rise of ministerial powers and then the rise of the importance of expertise and technologies and techniques of governing in instituting an effective governance, and also this idea of technology assistant governance. So I wonder if this kind of professionalization of governing, and not in sense of expanding autonomy, but in a sense of kind of new institutionalist pursuit of legitimacy, is also kind of working in the direction of instilling a new form of legitimacy in the local government, probably more prominently in the central government, that add another variable, sort of another phenomenon to reckon with into the Chinese study of governance here. And then the third question is actually about short-termism. So I'm really convinced that all these